Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror TV series named Lockwood and Company. Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with a special girl, Lucy, who is born unlike any other. From a young age, she displayed astonishing talents. As a baby, she cried incessantly, and no amount of soothing could calm her down. This kept her parents up all night. It was only later they discovered that she had been hearing the voices of wandering spirits in the streets. Before the age of 6, she could only hear them, but as she grew older, she started to see them as well. At the tender age of 13, her mother took her to interview at a paranormal investigative agency. Her exceptional abilities were highly valued by the boss. Before she joined, however, there were some things she needed to know. She could sense and combat both Type 1 and Type 2 ghosts, but the process could potentially lead to injury or even death. She would be responsible for her own safety, and any accidents would not be the agency's responsibility. Her mother accepted these conditions and agreed that her salary would be paid on the last Friday of each month, directly into her mother's account. Upon leaving the agency, Lucy voiced her protest. She was already afraid of hearing and seeing ghosts, and now she was being asked to work with them. She didn't want to enter the workforce so early. She wanted to return to school and continue her education, to live as an ordinary person. But her mother was adamant. Her father had drunk himself to death, leaving no inheritance. Her mother had had a tough time raising her, and their financial situation didn't allow her to continue her education. Thus, there was no room for negotiation on this matter. On her first day at the job, the boss handed Lucy over to Nori for ghost hunting training. She was to learn some basic knowledge first. There were many ways to deal with ghosts, such as specially made poisons and homemade bombs. Iron chains were indispensable since they could form a barrier when encountering ghosts, mainly serving a protective role. There were two common types of spirits, Type 1, which was weaker, and Type 2, which was stronger. It was absolutely crucial not to show fear in front of a ghost. The more afraid you were, the fiercer the ghost became. Lucy got along well with Nori, and she quickly completed her training and began her first mission. The scene then shifts to the top-floor guest room of a hotel filled with an eerie and ominous atmosphere. The hotel had remained vacant for a long time. Walking at the end of the group, Lucy suddenly turned around, sensing the presence of a ghost. She informed her companions, then pulled out a bomb and threw it at the ghost. The mission was completed successfully, and she gained the approval of her teammates. In their downtime, they practiced swordsmanship. The swords, forged from iron, could harm ghosts. There was an old saying in the business, "The better your swordsmanship, the longer your life." Over time, Lucy's abilities gradually improved, and she became a standout member of the team, saving Nori on numerous occasions. 2 years later, Lucy had successfully advanced to level 3, earning her own unique long sword and a fetus handbook. She wanted to celebrate with a few drinks, but Nori started worrying for her. With Lucy's capabilities, she should be seeking opportunities in better places, not stuck in this small town, letting her parents squander the money she earned. Lucy had thought about this too, but she couldn't leave until she reached level 4. So Nori suggested forging a recommendation letter. After all, Lucy was qualified enough and didn't need to worry about a mere piece of paper. Lucy, however, preferred to play it safe. She could wait till next year for a promotion. She had already endured 2 years, and after 1 more year, she could make her own decisions without seeking others' approval. She could join a renowned investigative agency and become the most famous paranormal investigator in the country. Lucy and Nori made a vow to leave the small town and prove themselves on a bigger stage. Soon after, they received another mission at the Marshgate Mill. A real estate developer wanted to acquire the place. The records about the haunting were vague, but all signs pointed towards a Type 1 spirit. On the way, Nori asked their bald boss about Fetus, the founder of the Feats ghost hunting agency. The boss had met Fitz once when he was young and training at an agency in London. Fitz was a legendary figure who discovered the connection between the haunting sources and imitation souls. Before that, the world was in chaos, with many people dying every day. Apparently, only Fitz had ever conversed with a powerful Type 3 spirit. They arrived at their destination after nightfall. The path inside was dark and terrifying. Lucy sensed something and could hear a child's laughter. Everyone followed her gaze. She felt uneasy. It didn't seem like a type 1. Watching the child run away, her teammates decided to follow while instructing her to report to the boss. Lucy disagreed, saying that they should retreat together, make a plan, and bring more equipment before returning. But no one listened to her. All she could do was warn Nori to be careful and rush outside to find the boss. But without evidence, just her feeling, the boss didn't agree to retreat. Soon, screams were heard from inside. She rushed in to find flashes of light and screams accompanying them. Nori stood frozen, already in a state of shock. Lucy managed to save Nori and closed the door while the boss, frightened by the terrifying atmosphere, left, disregarding her pleas. Afterward, the matter ended up in court, where the boss washed his hands off the responsibility, blaming faulty intel for the tragedy and claiming that he hadn't heard any cries for help. Lucy was furious, but her word alone wasn't enough to convict the boss. The incident was finally ruled as an accident. The deceased's name was engraved on a stone, and Nori, affected by the ghost encounter, fell into a vegetative state. No one knew if she would ever wake up. This incident had a significant impact on Lucy. She couldn't wait for next year's Level 4 assessment and boarded a train to London directly. On her journey, Lucy collected some job advertisements. Her first stop was the most famous Feats agency. A long queue of applicants was there. She waited for an hour, but without a Level 4 certificate and a recommendation letter, she didn't even get a chance to showcase her abilities. She tried other places as well, but with the same result. With less than 2 hours until curfew, she had to find a job, or she wouldn't have a place to sleep. The only place left was the Lockwood agency, one of London's smallest ghost hunting agencies. Although the chances were slim, she had to try. The young boy named George opened the door for her. Once she entered, she saw the previous interviewee had been frightened off. She then handed over her resume, and the boss, Lockwood, seemed interested. Her ability to hear spirits was exceptional, and her ability to see spirits was commendable too. His business partner, George, was also good at hearing spirits. Lockwood's forte was seeing spirits and could see the traces of ghostly halos and all sorts of terrifying remnants of death. He wasn't too bothered about her lack of a recommendation letter. As long as she could pass the test, that was enough. Next up was the testing phase. Lockwood presented an item and tapped it with his hand. The skull inside started to move. This was how the previous candidate had been frightened off. Lucy was better, though she was scared. She wasn't at the point of running away. Since it was a test, she had to comment, saying that this was a haunting jar. Its source was the skull, and the ghost was bound to it. She couldn't determine the type of ghost. It could be a specter or maybe a phantom. But her performance was quite satisfactory, and Lockwood seemed pleased. He then presented a second item, a gun. She held it in her hands, feeling its history. She could hear the sounds of gunfire, but there was no violence or sadness, no pain. The gun's previous owner seemed to have been quite happy and gentle. It was Lockwood's uncle's gun, and he was indeed a gentle man, as she had deduced. Next was a watch. She felt it again. She could hear the screams of agony related to death, and it had caused many deaths. It turned out this evil object was a memento of Lockwood's first case, which belonged to a serial killer. The final item was a cup. Lucy couldn't feel anything this time. It seemed to be just a normal cup. In fact, it was George's toothbrush cup, of course. She wouldn't feel anything. She was a bit angry, feeling like she'd been played with. She prepared to leave, but Lockwood apologized to her. This was an essential part of the test, and she passed with excellent results. Now it was Lucy's turn to make a choice, to stay or to go. She had nowhere else to go, so naturally she chose to stay. Lockwood gave a brief introduction to the newly established Paranormal Investigation Agency. It had been open for business for only 3 months. Like other agencies, they were insured and under control of the Regulatory Bureau for Psychical Research and Control. Currently, including her, there were only 3 members. Each one had a room, with the top one being a secret room. The kitchen was the most important place for their meeting. The tablecloth was called a thinking cloth, where they would jot down reminders and thoughts. Lockwood had once drawn a street map on it to find a ghoul's bones. The basement doubled as an office and a place to store case files. It was also a training ground. The storeroom was located here, with equipment and all sorts of odd things. The next stop was the attic. Lockwood had lived here when he was a child. It had a separate bathroom, and now it was Lucy's. Rent would be deducted from her salary. Lucy was quite satisfied with this place. From today onwards, she was a member of Lockwood Agency. Every time she passed by the secret room, she was curious. George reminded her that it was a forbidden area. Soon, Lockwood received a business offer and took Lucy with him to Mrs. Hope's house. They rang the doorbell, but no one answered. They saw a shadow flicker inside, but it wasn't Mrs. Hope, who was outside the house. She hadn't set foot inside since her husband's death. She intended to sell the house, but the paranormal disturbances persisted. Only by resolving this issue could she fetch a good price. Seeing their youth, she was somewhat worried, but since they had come anyway, she decided to give it a try. She handed them a form that Lockwood had previously sent her. The pair prepared outside the door. As soon as they entered, they felt a chilling presence. At the foot of the stairs, they paused to take in their surroundings. Lucy heard a faint knocking sound. Lockwood saw a spectral aura, followed by a scream rolling down the stairs, startling Lucy. It wasn't even sunset yet. They sat down and had a cup of tea, using the time to check the form. It's revealed that when the couple first moved in, everything was normal with no signs of a haunting. Later, her husband fell down the stairs. Mrs. Hope insisted he tripped while fetching water, but Lucy found it hard to believe, thinking that it could be that Mrs. Hope pushed him. Mrs. Hope always felt something was lurking inside the house, but couldn't find anything. Based on Mrs. Hope's description, the two surmised that the ghost was of the second type. As soon as the sun set, they began their work. Lucy heard knocking upstairs. The further up she went, the louder the sound. When she reached the second floor, the sound stopped and the temperature dropped. Lockwood turned off his flashlight. Now it was time to choose a room. Lucy chose the farthest one. It looked terrifying. They pushed the door open and found it was an office space, but there were deep indentations in the carpet. They deduced that before the Hopes moved in, it might be used as a bedroom. Lucy could sense the source of the haunting was here. They split up. Lucy went to fetch the hunting equipment, while Lockwood went to check the other rooms. When Lucy came back up, she noticed something unusual. There was a faint light in the room which slowly grew into a spirit. She quickly called Lockwood. Lockwood was busy at that moment and found another spectral aura, indicating that 2 violent deaths had occurred here. It was unknown whether the 2 deaths were related. The evil spirit was getting closer. Lucy had already drawn her sword for self-protection. Lockwood came later and also drew his sword ready to fight. Lucy closed her eyes and sensed the spirit's pain, which wasn't the pain of death, but different. It kept repeating, "Let me go." Then it showed a ferocious face and pounced on Lucy. Lucy almost fell. Lockwood stepped forward to drive away the spirit. Just as Lucy was about to give up, he finally came to the rescue. They had planned a retreat, but Lucy wanted to continue. She had seen the spirit's appearance and could sense its pain. This had never happened before. Lockwood advised her to stay calm. The situation had escalated, and the spirit they encountered might be from a homicide case. Although it was temporarily repelled, it could return at any time. But Lucy chose to continue. Lockwood had no choice but to accompany her. The spirit disappeared when it reached the wall, so the body was likely inside the wall. They spread iron filings on the ground and started breaking the wall with tools. Lockwood accidentally broke the protective circle. Lucy quickly repaired it. When she looked up, she saw the ghost had returned. The door was suddenly closed. Lockwood then mocked the spirit's old tricks, causing it to get angry. In the process, Lockwood lost his balance and bumped into Lucy. They both fell to the ground. Seeing the spirit was about to attack Lockwood, Lucy threw a bomb, causing the spirit to temporarily retreat. Sparks ignited a nearby bookshelf. They looked back and saw the spirit's body in the wall. The corpse was the source of the haunting. Lockwood was responsible for holding off the ghost, while Lucy used a silver net to cover the corpse. But Lucy didn't follow the plan. She closed her eyes again to feel the meaning of the spirit's words, "Let me go." Her eyes shifted to the ring on the corpse's finger. It was an old, tarnished wedding ring. Lucy's gaze moved to the hand of the corpse where the ring seemed to be the focal point. Just as a ghost rushed forward, Lucy quickly covered the corpse with a silver net and removed the ring from its hand before making her escape with Lockwood by jumping off the balcony. Upon landing, Lucy passed out and had a vision of the spirit bringing her flowers and revealing its face. When Lucy woke up, she found herself alone and Lockwood was nowhere to be found. A large fire had drawn everyone's attention, and the authorities from the Regulatory Bureau arrived to take Lucy to the hospital. The hospital informed her family, but to her relief, her mother did not ask for her location and quickly ended the call. As Lucy prepared to leave, she noticed flowers on the table, identical to those the ghost had given her. She took one and left the ward, opening a random door to find a room full of victims of supernatural events. Meanwhile, Lockwood was taken in by the Regulatory Bureau for questioning, accused of intentionally setting a fire and destroying Mrs. Hope's house. He tried to explain, but was handed a document stating that he owed Mrs. Hope $60,000 to be paid within 2 weeks, or his ghost hunting agency would be shut down. Although he had insurance, due to several violations including using magnesium flares indoors, the Regulatory Bureau refused to compensate. They suggested an adult should handle it, stating it wasn't child's play. In short, he either needed to pay up or shut down the agency. On the other hand, when Lucy returned to the agency, George's first question about Lockwood's whereabouts saddened her. She had nearly died from jumping down a high balcony. She was unsure about Lockwood's whereabouts. George had been there the previous night, but he arrived late. He was gathering information for a better response, indicating that the situation in Mrs. Hope's house was more complicated than just her old husband falling down the stairs. Lucy then noticed a report on the table, realizing that the spirit was a woman named Anna, a rising star in the 1980s who disappeared when she was about to break into Hollywood. It seemed that she didn't disappear. She was murdered and hidden in the wall of the house. When Lockwood returned, he seemed tired and said he would discuss things after he had slept. In her room, Lucy took out the ring and flower from her pocket, again seeing the image of the spirit giving her the flowers and hearing the phrase, "Let me go," as if the spirit was being asked for help. Lucy started behaving strangely as if she was possessed, taking a bath fully clothed. If it weren't for George waking her, she might have drowned. Once she pulled herself together, Lucy recorded her experiences of these days, planning to send the recording to the vegetative Nori, who was hospitalized far away. Meanwhile, George asked Lockwood about the fire in Mrs. Hope's house that had made them famous, causing many clients to cancel their orders. George felt that Lucy should take the main responsibility, especially since she was acting strangely. He suggested that it might be better to fire her. Lockwood didn't think there was a problem, stating that girls have many ways of taking baths and that he would handle the fire incident. After all, he himself was not normal, and George even less so. If George were normal, he wouldn't have left Fitt's agency to follow Lockwood. The gathering of 3 abnormal people was bound to ignite something different. On the other side, Lucy fell asleep with the ring in her hand. When she turned over, the ring fell to the floor. A white mist billowed out from the ring, taking on the form of Anna and hovering in front of Lucy. Lucy woke up with a start. Although a bit scared, she managed to tell the spirit that she wouldn't help her if she dared to harm her. Anna roared like a goose in anger, and Lucy promptly fled to wake up Lockwood and then George. The 3 of them cautiously made their way to the attic, but it was empty. Lockwood found it unbelievable. They had already contained the haunting source by encasing the corpse with a silver net. Anna couldn't possibly come here, and there was no reason for her to do so. Besides, there was no haunting source here. Lucy fell silent. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared, then reappeared behind George. George dodged at Lockwood's warning. Lockwood and Lucy immediately launched an attack, but it didn't cause any substantial harm. The priority was to find the haunting source. Lucy was suddenly attacked, but Lockwood was quick to respond. The 3 of them stood back to back. Lucy remembered the ring, but she had lost it during her sleep and didn't know where it was. Anna appeared again, and the 3 of them prepared for combat. Lockwood struck Anna with his sword, and Lucy and George threw their items at her. After Anna disappeared, they sealed up the ring again. At last, they had resolved this trouble. Lucy apologized for stealing the ring. She didn't know the ring was the haunting source. She just wanted to help Anna. If the Regulatory Bureau found out, they would be done for. But she wasn't the first person to do this. Lockwood and George had stolen many things. The 2 intended to destroy the haunting source and put an end to this matter. But Lucy had a different opinion. Anna's obsession was so strong, trapped in the wall for as long as 40 years. She must have wanted Lucy to solve this case and uphold justice for her. Before destroying the ring, Lucy wanted to experience it one more time. She might discover something new. Moreover, she had developed a connection with the spirit. This was worth studying, and hearing that, George changed his position. With a 2 versus 1 vote, Lockwood had to compromise. They had been a bit embarrassed in their hasty response earlier, but they were now fully prepared and confident that nothing would go wrong. The ring was passed to Lucy. Lucy then closed her eyes, clutching the ring and focusing on her feelings. Anna began to communicate with her, recounting her tragic experiences, even attaching herself to Lucy. That day, Anna was dancing with her loved one in the room. The atmosphere was harmonious and they were in high spirits. Her partner had a tendency towards abuse. Anna was a bit resistant, but he became more aggressive. Anna actually liked him and had accepted his ring. She had planned to compromise, but her partner lost control and strangled Anna to death. Seeing Lucy's condition deteriorating, George pulled open the curtains. A chair flew over, and Lockwood, holding Lucy, dodged it. With a flash of lightning, Anna disappeared and Lucy recovered. Although they had figured out what happened, Lockwood had no intention of continuing. He put away the ring. It wasn't the time to take on cases based on personal preferences. There was still a bill to pay. They looked at the bill, $60,000 to be paid within 2 weeks, and immediately felt a headache. It was hard enough to maintain normal operations of the agency, let alone with such a large bill. Lockwood's house, the only asset his parents left him, had already been mortgaged to run the agency. As for George and Lucy, they were dependent on Lockwood for their livelihood. The only solution at present was to take on some big cases and earn a good amount of money. The phone rang just then, and they thought it was a big business opportunity. However, it turned out to be a call from the Regulatory Bureau, demanding immediate termination of Lucy. Lucy had not yet reached level 4, therefore she could not be employed. The Regulatory Bureau didn't want any bad press and hoped that Lockwood would take the hint. After hanging up the phone, Lockwood didn't say anything but changed his previous thoughts. He dragged the two of them off to work on Anna's case. Anna was once a highly popular star with a high profile. If they could uncover the truth, it would definitely overshadow the scandal of the house fire. It could even become front-page news, filling their coffers and boosting their reputation. They could also give a good account to the Regulatory Bureau. The trio headed to the archives for information. Anna once played Ophelia in Hamlet, who drowned while holding daisies. That's why the possessed Lucy was lying in the bathtub wearing clothes. Hamlet was not good to Ophelia, causing her to go mad and end her life. Although Anna didn't kill herself, Hamlet and Ophelia could be matched with Anna and her abusive lover. They suspected that the murderer of Anna could very likely be the actor who played Hamlet, a man named Hugo. Lockwood found a piece of news where Hugo had been arrested by the police. The police suspected he was involved in Anna's disappearance. There were rumors that the two were in a romantic relationship, but there were no witnesses, no evidence, and no body. Hugo was eventually acquitted. After figuring out the direction of the investigation, Lockwood immediately went to the media to expose some doubts about Anna's disappearance. He even dragged the Regulatory Bureau into it, accusing them of neglecting unresolved cases. He also praised Lucy, saying that she had exceptional abilities, had eliminated an evil type 2, and had psychic powers that allowed her to communicate with Anna's spirit. Offending the Regulatory Bureau was within Lockwood's expectations, but he didn't expect Lucy to be upset. She had said before that she didn't want to be the focus of the public, and Lockwood's behavior was obviously using her as a money-making tool. Soon after, Inspector Barnes from the Regulatory Bureau came to talk to Lucy. Because of the effect of the news, the Bureau temporarily dared not touch Lucy and had to deal with Anna's case. Hugo had already been brought in, but there was no related evidence, and they needed Lucy's help. To put it another way, they needed her to demonstrate her ability to communicate with Anna and identify Hugo as the murderer. If she couldn't do it, Lockwood's statements would be characterized as fabrications, deceiving the public in order to keep her job. Looking at Hugo on the other side, she felt a bit breathless. She couldn't do it under such circumstances. The inspector took out a train ticket, persuading her to go back to her own town and stay away from Lockwood, a swindler who specialized in deceiving minors like her. There were many victims who had been deceived. There were already cracks between her and Lockwood. With the inspector's instigation, she thought about leaving. She had finally found a sense of belonging, only to fall into confusion again. Lockwood apologized to her. Mentioning her name in front of the reporters was just a strategy, nothing more. Lockwood's goal was simple: break the rules, break prejudices, and control his own destiny instead of being controlled by others. This path was difficult and required the help of Lucy and George. Finally, Lucy forgave Lockwood. She agreed to stay on the condition that he promised not to lie to her in the future. Just as Lockwood was making his promise, he lit a firework. She thought he was trying to set the mood, but that wasn't the case. There were 5 shadowy figures and 3 lurking ghosts approaching. Meanwhile, George, who was home alone, noticed that the door was left ajar. As he approached, a shadowy figure suddenly ambushed him. By the time Lucy and Lockwood arrived, the door had already been locked from the inside. They had to enter through a window. Just as they made it inside, they heard the sound of something shattering. Their first thought was that Hugo had shown up. Lockwood peeked through the door gap, and indeed, there was a man in black. They decided to split up. Lockwood would take on the man in black while Lucy went to look for George. As she passed by the door, she noticed a plate and a pair of glasses on the floor. She then heard George yelling for help. Lucy picked up the glasses and headed for the basement, where she found George. After rescuing him, the 3 of them teamed up against the man in black. Seeing that, the man in black escaped through a window. Even though they didn't know who the man in black was, they were sure he was linked to Hugo because he had taken Anna's ring. Lockwood and George were disheartened because the ring was their only piece of evidence. However, Lucy revealed that she had taken the ring earlier. The 3 began to study the ring and found a mark on it, H22. They guessed H stood for Hugo. The mark was a love letter from Anna, hoping that Lucy would take the ring. It could prove that Hugo and Anna had been a couple, but that wasn't enough to send Hugo to prison. The ring could only prove their past relationship. It wasn't evidence that Hugo had killed Anna. Lockwood put the ring in a safe, with him keeping the keys. The final judgment for the arson case had been made, which ruled that the Lockwood agency couldn't take on any jobs until they had paid the fine of $60,000, unless they were supervised by an adult. But none of the three had parents. Lockwood had a brilliant idea, saying that they should seek someone who needed them to hunt the ghost. He found an ad in the newspaper. An iron factory was hiring investigators for unusual paranormal investigations. The job was dangerous, but it paid well. Their task was to secure this job. As the elevator reached the top floor, they entered a luxurious office. It belonged to John, the owner of the iron factory, who was wealthy and influential. After a brief greeting, they sat down to discuss in detail. John was planning to sell several properties, including the manor in Berkshire. The manor was superb, except for a group of haunting spirits. He had gone to great lengths to keep this news from the press, so potential buyers had no idea about it. The reason for hiring paranormal investigators was to ensure safety before potential buyers viewed the house, and the house could not be damaged. No flares or explosives could be used. The owner had already received quotes from major agencies in London. An infamous agency like Lockwood's could only secure this job by offering a lower price. Lockwood had hoped to impress him with the quality of service, but that approach was not effective. George said that big detective agencies like Fitz need to discuss every decision with a committee. It wouldn't be possible to keep the haunting a secret. The owner needed a more flexible approach. The big agency quoted $90,000, but Lockwood was willing to do it for $60,000, just enough to cover the fine. Hearing that, John promptly agreed. With the fine covered, the trio began preparations. George was responsible for investigating all the information about the manor. Lucy was in charge of packing, while Lockwood planned to visit the satchel store to see if he could find any non-explosive tools. In the evening, George had already gathered all the information about the manor. It wasn't just a countryside villa, but a small satanic chapel used by medieval devil worshippers. Many people had died there, including some guests at a banquet 30 years ago. However, these deaths were not caused by the monks, but by the screaming staircase and red house, which were claimed to be haunted. Attempting this task without flares was akin to a death sentence. They were not the first ones to try. During the early stages of the paranormal events, the Fitz team had visited the place, with only one survivor living to tell the tale and another named Sam still missing. Lockwood knew the task was dangerous, but to keep the agency running, they had to accept this task. Lucy received a call from Inspector Barnes asking whether she had told Lockwood about her plans to leave. She said she would leave in 2 days. The inspector advised her to leave earlier because Hugo had been released and that he would send someone tomorrow to discuss the new supervisor's matter. But Lucy and her team would be at the manor hunting ghosts tomorrow and wouldn't be home. She couldn't tell the inspector the truth, so she lied that their house was being fumigated and they wouldn't be there tomorrow. He said if they weren't there tomorrow, the day after would work too, but someone had to meet Lockwood. After hanging up, Lucy looked at Anna's photo. Taking advantage of Lockwood's absence, she stealthily took the safe keys and removed the ring. The next day, the three arrived in the countryside as planned. Lockwood briefly introduced John, who was successful in many fields, including publishing and the entertainment industry. They were received by John's assistant, who helped with their luggage. Lockwood noticed that her shoulder was not in good shape. She mentioned it was an old injury and then led them to the mansion. Upon entering, Lucy seemed to hear something but didn't pay much attention. The owner, John, was also there, urging them to drop their luggage and start working as the sun was about to set. They were in a gallery built on the ruins of the original chapel where monks had decided to commit mass suicide. During their conversation, the assistant reported that Lockwood had violated the rules and brought a flare. To ensure Lockwood didn't burn down the house, John took the flare away and showed the trio their way. They would find the screaming staircase through here, which would lead them to the red house, which was likely the source of the haunting. After finishing, the assistant left and handed the location over to the trio. Meanwhile, the regulatory team arrived at Lockwood's agency. Despite knocking, there was no response from inside, so they ordered the door to be broken down. At the same time, Lucy tried to sense the source of the ghosts, but to no avail. Lockwood went to fetch something. He had visited the place after going to the satchel store yesterday and hidden a flare outside. He knew John would check their bags, so he used the flare in his bag as a decoy. Once John found the flare in the bag, he would feel relieved. This way, Lockwood could fetch the outside flare. After all, it was impossible to do this job without a flare. With everything ready, the three arrived at the red house as pointed out by John. There were many ghostly screams, and the house's color wasn't very red. Lucy was responsible for setting up chains. George was in charge of securing the retreat route. The current room temperature was low and dropping, indicating something was approaching. Surprisingly, there were no signs of the haunting source. According to the floor plan of the room, there might be a hidden chamber here. Lockwood and Lucy looked for things that might be hiding the haunting source, while George guarded them in the defensive circle. The room temperature dropped to 5 degrees. Lucy seemed to have found something, but before they could check, strange things began to happen. Both immediately jumped into the defensive circle. Looking up, they saw blood expanding on the ceiling, even dripping into the defensive circle. This was something they hadn't expected. The door automatically closed as they were preparing to retreat. They were trapped in the red house and had to find another exit. Lucy went to investigate the place where they had heard the noise earlier. Lockwood and George attempted to lure out the ghost as the bloodstains on the ceiling increased, starting to spread across the walls. It seemed they were dealing with more than one ghost as the blood crept closer and closer to them. At a critical moment, Lucy managed to force open a door, allowing the trio to escape narrowly. Normally, only shape-shifting ghosts could manifest in the form of blood, but it wouldn't be on such a large scale. They wondered if they had encountered a new type of spirit. However, they soon realized this couldn't be the case as the spirits couldn't move heavy iron objects. The only plausible explanation was that these events were the work of a living person, perhaps the assistant testing them. The room's temperature started to drop again, suggesting that the red house wasn't the original source of the haunting, but a secondary location. There was something else at play here. The trio followed a path forward and encountered the ghost of Sam, who seemed to be warning them not to go down to the basement. Slowly, they reached the top of the stairs, guessing this might be the real screaming staircase. After all, the owner, John, loved surprises and was a big name in the entertainment industry. Speaking of which, Lockwood seemed to recall something and asked the others to wait. Hearing a noise, Lucy ran downstairs with Lockwood following close behind. In the basement, they found a well, the final resting place of the monks. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the stairs, the ghost of a monk. Lockwood instructed George to find the source of the hauntings, while he and Lucy dealt with the ghost. When George didn't find the source, he did find Sam, who had disappeared from the Fitz ghost hunting team. At this point, a ghost possessed Lucy, leading her to the edge of the well, ready to jump in. Fortunately, Lockwood and George managed to pull her heavy body back just in time, saving her greasy life. Being possessed led Lucy to the source of the hauntings. It's the well with the bodies inside. Lockwood threw a flare into it, causing an explosion that eliminated the ghosts of the monks, but also knocked the trio unconscious. Lucy was the first to wake up, rousing George and Lockwood. Lockwood pulled out a photo of John and Anna. Before John entered the iron industry, he was the most well-connected person in the district. Lockwood speculated that John didn't just know Anna, they actually had an affair. The ring was probably a gift from John to Anna. The strange mark on it suggested that John had it custom-made, which meant there would be a record of it. Lockwood believed that John had likely killed Anna, and the ring was evidence. It's then revealed that John lured the trio here to eliminate witnesses. Given the ominous nature of the place and the deaths of 3 investigators here, nobody would suspect foul play. Now, they had to leave as quickly as possible, avoiding exiting through the red house. They spotted a light on the wall which indicated an exit. Just as they emerged, they ran into John and his assistant. It turned out that the assistant was the person in black who had broken into Lockwood's house. Her shoulder wound wasn't old, but was inflicted by Lockwood that day. He guessed that John regretted buying the ring for Anna. Actually, what John regretted was not taking the ring away when he hid Anna's body in the wall. He wanted to retrieve the ring and hoped Lockwood would hand it over. Lockwood didn't have the ring with him, and only he knew where it was hidden. If John killed him, he would never get the ring back. John pointed a gun at Lockwood. Seeing this, Lucy removed a necklace from around her neck, took out the ring, and threw it into the air. Anna's ghost appeared suddenly and killed John on the spot, then turned to Lucy as if to thank her. Lockwood quickly collected the ring as Anna's ghost disappeared. The assistant tried to escape, but when she opened the door, she saw that the entrance was swarming with police. There was no chance of escape. Afterwards, the trio didn't gain any fame for cracking the case. Instead, they were arrested by the Regulatory Bureau for operating without a license. They tried to explain that someone had just tried to kill them. It was John, who had collaborated with the Regulatory Bureau, and he had also murdered Anna. They had evidence, the photo, and a witness, John's assistant. She had clearly heard John confessing to his crimes. Just then, they received a report that the deputy chief of the Regulatory Bureau was on his way. Forced to keep the trio confined to their car, Inspector Barnes wondered what the deputy chief was doing here at 5 a.m., still moving things around, and why there were badges on the boxes. Before the trio could figure it out, Inspector Barnes came to inform the trio that they wouldn't arrest them, provided they signed a confidentiality agreement. Without signing, no one would protect them. For their safety, the trio signed the agreement, despite their reluctance. Not long after, Fetus Agency held a funeral for Sam. Fitz's daughter thanked the trio. Her mother was the team leader during the first investigation of the manor, and she was the only survivor. Sam's disappearance had always been a burden on her mother, and she was grateful that the trio found Sam's body. She knew each of their names, which was gratifying to them. It felt like all their efforts had been recognized. After John's case, the Regulatory Bureau covered everything up, claiming that John died of natural causes in an attempt to preserve his reputation. George didn't care what they were doing this for. He thought that everything was fine for the agency as long as they received a reward of $60,000 to pay off the fine and was relieved of supervision. But Lockwood didn't think the same way. Without fame, they were still a small, unknown team, and no big clients would come to them. Seeing what George had in his hands, Lockwood scolded him to put it in the safe because it was stolen from the crime scene. He just wanted to know what the badge was about, why it appeared on those boxes and this pair of goggles. He then reminded Lucy to be careful. The psychic power was a double-edged sword. It could make or break them. While speaking, he was interrupted by Lucy taking the goggles to put away. Lockwood asked her to run an errand downstairs, handing her a 4th-level certificate. Lucy went to the basement, casually placed the goggles on the ghost jar, kept the certificate, and then casually picked up the goggles. Accidentally, she opened the jar, and immediately there were noises behind her, all calling out her name. Lucy was terrified. The two upstairs didn't know the situation in the basement, and were still discussing that Lucy was getting too close to Anna and would eventually be exhausted. Just then, there was a noise from the basement. They called out a few times without getting a response and hurried towards the basement. By this time, Lucy had collapsed on the ground. Fortunately, she was all right and would recover after a rest. Later, she went downstairs to find her colleagues, but both were not there. They had left a note on the table saying that Lockwood and George had gone ghost hunting. She was alone at home and ate some bread. The door to the basement was open, and a force was drawing her in. As she was about to check it out, the bread machine behind her suddenly sounded, interrupting her actions. At this time, Lockwood and George returned. It didn't look like things had gone smoothly. There were too many ghosts, and they had run out of flares. They were nearly killed, but were rescued by the Kipps team. Kipps was Lockwood's arch-nemesis. While it was said they were saved, it was actually a case of business being stolen. They had been busy all night and got nothing. This was very frustrating. They asked about Lucy's condition. She didn't know what had happened in the basement, only remembered that she had fainted after putting away the documents. She hadn't had any hallucinations or heard any strange sounds. As the conversation was ongoing, the doorbell rang. A major client had arrived. They were from a company called Sweet Dream Excavation. Simply put, they were gravediggers. The Regulatory Bureau had issued regulations requiring the City Council to evaluate cemeteries, identifying risky areas. The client's company was responsible for the Kensal Green Cemetery. He and his business partner Pamela held part-time roles. One dug graves, the other dug stories. Pamela would use burial records to find traumatic causes of death that might increase the chance of a ghost appearing. Suicide, murder, sudden accidents, all of these could potentially awaken a ghost. Though the Feats Agency was well equipped for the job, they didn't understand why they were chosen over Lockwood. While Fitz had an extensive database, it lacked depth. Lockwood, on the other hand, was not so interested. His agency specialized in mansion cases and didn't do odd jobs for the city council. However, the current situation didn't allow him to be picky. As long as there was a case, he'd take it. He needed to earn money to support his team. What attracted Lockwood wasn't the pay, but the fact that the cemetery was located in an old district with a long history. This made the spirits even more interesting to him. They had to deal with an unnamed cemetery, not on any official list. It was initially discovered by a medium hired by the company, but the spirit was too powerful. Suspected to be a Type 2 ghost, the company had to request a ghost hunting agency to resolve it. However, the work had to be carried out at night. Cemetery watchmen, mediums, and security personnel were all available to assist them in completing their task. It sounded exhilarating, and Lockwood readily agreed. After dark, they set off. There were many people gathered at the cemetery entrance, all members of spirit worship groups. They believed it was better to accept the spirits than to fight them. Passing through the cemetery, they came upon a house where everyone was gathered. Despite the crowd, when it came down to it, only the paranormal investigation team could dare to take action. The team checked out the grave where the coffin had already been unearthed but not yet opened. Lockwood employed his psychic sight but saw no death halo. Lucy used her psychic power to sense faint vibrations. They didn't delay and started their ghost hunt. George conducted the first round of checks, with Lockwood standing guard to prevent intrusions. Looking at the yet-to-be-opened coffin, which was not buried very deep and whose surface was uneven, George knew that the burial had been rushed, neither professional nor legal. Suddenly, Lucy started feeling off. The spirit's power was strong, and she was having trouble dealing with it. At that moment, Pamela arrived to check on progress and asked if they needed help. Lucy's condition worsened. She was becoming breathless and started to drift into a semi-conscious state, recalling what had happened in the basement before she fainted. Lockwood's concern brought her back to reality, and George made a new discovery. The coffin was made of metal. What terrifying thing was buried inside that would make the people burying the deceased resort to such measures? The situation was more complex than they'd anticipated. They needed more time to research, but were running out of time. They had to open the coffin and seal the haunting source. Lucy, affected by the situation, was not on her game. She kept hearing the buzzing of flies, which George couldn't hear, but it made him feel nauseous. Lockwood, unaffected, was the first to get into the grave to open the coffin. Lucy stayed above ground to provide support, ready to cast a silver net as soon as the time was right. Unable to concentrate in this environment, Lucy kept recalling the screams from the basement. She drew her sword out of fear and accidentally injured herself in the process. Her hand hurt severely. Seeing this, Pamela immediately called for backup. After digging up all the soil, a peculiar sight came into view. It didn't resemble a coffin. There was a hole on top, and the spirit's power seemed to be emanating from it. It needed to be dealt with quickly. George opened the coffin. Lockwood was on standby, ready for combat, while Lucy was still in extreme pain. Inside the coffin, a round object was continuously spinning. Upon seeing this, George was spellbound. Thankfully, Lockwood reacted swiftly, pulling George away and calling out to Lucy to cast her net. Even though Lucy was not in her best condition, she remembered her task and accomplished it. The instant the net covered the coffin, the strange sensation disappeared. Reinforcements arrived just in time. They would handle the situation from here. After regaining his senses, George mentioned that there was a bullet hole in the skull. The deceased must have died from a gunshot. The strange burial item in the coffin seemed like a mirror, one that felt capable of swallowing people whole. But their task was done, and it was no longer their responsibility to research this. The following cleanup would be handled by the Regulatory Bureau. Pamela wanted to ask Lucy a few questions, but she was distracted by a tombstone nearby and went to investigate. George stayed behind to answer any queries. A skull on the tombstone reminded Lucy of the one sealed in the basement, causing a bit of fear. She mumbled incessantly, insisting it was speaking. Lockwood looked back at the two, noticing George crossing the chain barrier, an act he considered risky. The temperature sensor was continuously dropping. George stumbled and fell next to the coffin. When he got up, he accidentally moved the spirit sealing net. Chaos ensued as a ghost burst from the coffin, forming a huge phantom. Fearless, Lucy drew her sword to confront the phantom, eliminating it in one fell swoop. George quickly covered the coffin with the net, and the situation was resolved finally. Lucy headed straight for the basement of the agency, opening the valve of the ghost jar. The skull inside began to speak, leaving Lucy feeling as though she was going mad. She was actually communicating with a Type 3 spirit, a highly powerful and dangerous existence. The skull claimed that Lockwood had many secrets and offered to reveal them all to Lucy, but it required release from the jar. Lucy knew she couldn't do that. Just as she was about to close the valve, the skull sensed the supernatural energy on her. It asked her where she had been and mentioned something about an impending death. Aghast, Lucy quickly closed the valve, silencing it. Upon his return, George started looking for information, claiming that the burial item resembling a mirror had an inscription that needed to be translated. Lockwood felt it was unnecessary. Their task was done, and anything beyond that was not their concern. George's problem hadn't been resolved, and Lucy brought another issue. She told Lockwood to keep an eye on the skull, as it had spoken. It was because of it that Lucy had fainted yesterday. Lockwood and the others didn't believe her, as the claim seemed too incredible and unprecedented. Lucy could not relay the skull's exact words to Lockwood. There were dangerous items in the upstairs secret room. If true, it meant that the skull was a sentient Type 3, and Lucy had the ability to communicate with it. No matter how she explained, Lockwood would not believe her. It's still unclear whether he was pretending or if there was indeed something in the room he didn't want Lucy to know. In his mind, no one but Fetus could communicate with the Type 3 spirit. Although Lockwood was unwilling to believe Lucy, she knew she had this ability. She had watched Fetus's early videotapes, learning about the Type 3 spirits, those who openly refuse to leave the mortal realm. They possess extraordinary power and wisdom. They can think, perceive, and speak like the living, and continue to venture alone in eternal darkness until someone with exceptional psychic power can communicate with them. Upon hearing this, Lockwood went to find Lucy to apologize for his earlier disbelief and tended to her wounds. During this time, he started telling his own story. When he was 6, his parents passed away. He grew up alone, a painful experience that he preferred not to mention to others. That secret room represented his past, which is why he would become angry and embarrassed. Lucy was quite touched by this and shared what the skull had told her. They wanted to discuss it with George, but he wasn't in the room. He had already deciphered the inscription, which meant the truth lies beyond. At this point, George had gone to the place where the bones were stored, wanting to see what exactly the mirror was. But before he could start, Inspector Barnes arrived. The bones had only been dug up a few hours prior, and the mirror had been stolen. They hadn't yet found out who had done it, but the case was no longer Lockwood's responsibility. The inspector had assigned another agency to take over. It's Lockwood's rival, Kipps. As soon as they showed up and exchanged greetings, Lockwood and Lucy arrived. They couldn't let the Kipps agency steal the case, but it was too late. The Kipps team had conducted a preliminary investigation. The first question was why the iron coffin predated the ghostly manifestation by 100 years. According to Fetus's database, it's recorded that the so-called iron coffin was actually a distiller. In the late 19th century, breweries used this kind of thing. The Kipps team also found that in 1886, there was a violent labor dispute at a brewery in Kilburn. The workers mistook the brewer for the boss, killed him, and hastily buried him. The mirror was the brewer's precious personal item, which is why it became the source of the haunting. They mocked Lockwood's investigation as merely scratching the surface, but George had discovered more crucial information. He explained why someone would carry a distiller 3 kilometers to bury a body. It was because it was made of iron and could prevent evil spirits from causing chaos. The inscription on the mirror was in Phoenician, which was very popular in the metaphysics circles of the Victorian era. It meant "the truth lies beyond" and was the slogan of the Open Heart Society. Therefore, George claimed that the victim's death was no accident. The victim was secretly executed and buried by a metaphysician. In that era, the rich often marked their possessions to prevent theft. The cane placed in the coffin had the family crest of Bickerstaff engraved on it. George remembered the client saying that Kensal Green Cemetery in London was famous and operated by the Bickerstaff family. But one family member, a doctor named Edmund, was discovered to be secretly exhuming bodies and was labeled a necrophiliac, becoming a topic of conversation over meals. If George's guess was correct, the person in the coffin should be Edmund, not the brewer as they had thought. George's reasoning crushed the Kipps team, and the case should have belonged to them. The two sides argued endlessly about this. Inspector Barnes decided to let the two teams jointly investigate the case. They agreed on the surface, but were unwilling to cooperate privately. Lockwood even proposed a competition. Whoever found the lost mirror first would win. The loser would see an ad congratulating the winner in the newspaper, but Kipps challenged that the loser would have to quit the business forever. Lockwood accepted the challenge and the competition was on. Early the next morning, Lockwood began packing, ready to take action. Lucy wanted them to get a head start by questioning the skull for clues. However, the skull was uncooperative. Since they lacked any external assistance, they would have to conduct the investigation themselves. Lucy suddenly remembered the skull mentioning that death was approaching. But Lockwood wasn't scared. As long as they worked together, there was no case they couldn't solve. After breakfast, the trio headed to the cemetery in search of clues. Surprisingly, Kipps arrived before them. Lockwood chose not to respond to Kipps's sarcastic comments. He thought if the mirror had been stolen by grave robbers, at least 2 people would be needed to pull off such a stealthy job. Maybe there was a mole among the security staff. George found a badge at the scene, its insignia representing the Tandy Ghost Hunting Agency. He suspected that it could be the work of one of Tandy's team members. As George was musing over this, he took a glance at his coffee. The swirling foam reminded him of the mirror and he became lost in thought. Lockwood's call brought him back to reality. They had finished examining the scene, and it was time for George to visit the archives to research related materials. Lockwood and Lucy stayed behind to look for other clues, imagining themselves as grave robbers. To enter and leave the cemetery undetected, it would be more likely to scale the wall from the canal side. The water route was safe and far from the main gate. Even if they knocked someone out, no one would hear. Despite their efforts, they were still a step behind. George had thought of this earlier and decided to check the area before heading to the archives. Nearby, a gravestone had bloody fingerprints, and there were drops of blood by the canal. On following the trail, they discovered a body in the canal, its eyes gouged out. Lockwood arrived to find he recognized the man. It was Danny, a seasoned ghost hunter who had helped him on numerous occasions, though they weren't very close. The police dredged the entire canal but found no trace of the mirror. The victim's fingernails contained a significant amount of ocular tissue, leading to the conclusion that he had inflicted the injury on himself. Perhaps he had fallen into madness after seeing the mirror. Now that they had made a discovery, they needed to make progress. If the mirror fell into the hands of someone with ill intentions, the consequences would be disastrous. Upon hearing this, Kipps immediately sprung into action, and Lockwood couldn't stand idle either. He decided to seek help from his old friends. George, as planned, went to the archives. However, he was a little late and the archives were already full, so he would have to come back another day. On his way home, he ran into Pamela, a super VIP of the archives, so she got George in. On the other side, Lockwood and Lucy went under the bridge to seek help from a mysterious old friend. During their search, Lockwood heard some strange noises. Looking towards the source, he saw a ghostly figure. Upon closer inspection, it was a baby. Wondering how it had been abandoned there, the baby suddenly went wild and let out a piercing scream. A ghostly lady appeared at that moment, heading straight for Lucy. Lockwood saw this and rushed to help, but it was too late. Lucy tripped over a stone, and it looked like the ghostly lady was about to attack. A timely intervention saved her. It was Lockwood's friend Flo, the most formidable relic hunter on the Thames. Although she also searched for burial items, she was different from grave robbers. She took the baby's remains, planning to sell them on the black market. Lockwood had a better idea, to sell them to an orphanage museum. They offered a higher price than the black market, and it was an excellent place for the remains. If she agreed, Lockwood could act as the middleman, ensuring her identity would not be revealed. After all, what she did was illegal. In return, she would have to disclose some information about Danny, as they were quite familiar with each other. At the archives, George was still reviewing materials. As he read, he started drawing circles, a likely side effect of the mirror. The curfew time had passed and they needed to leave. Thanks to Pamela's help, they now had leads for the case. On the other side, Flo agreed to Lockwood's proposal. Danny was addicted to alcohol, which was how they caught him. Flo called them scum, and the Tandy agency where Danny worked didn't care about his well-being. The crucial thing now was to find Danny's partner, who was definitely there when the incident happened but did nothing to help. Speaking of the partner, Flo thought it was Jack. She kindly advised against messing with him, but given the urgency of the situation, no clues could be neglected. So she told Lockwood how to contact Jack, to leave a message on the discussion board. When Jack saw it, he would come looking. However, the content of the message had to be enticing to increase the chance of meeting Jack. Lockwood got straight to the point, claiming he knew where the mirror was, then left an address. Flo shared a piece of information. The burial items that Danny and his group stole would be given to the Winkman couple to fence. The Winkman couple claimed to be antique dealers to the public. Flo specifically warned not to mess with them, or there would be a heavy price to pay. Lockwood took note of these words and handed Flo Danny's badge, which was left at the scene. He gave it to her as a memento. Jack was long overdue with any news, and Lockwood couldn't wait any longer. The mirror needed to be recovered as soon as possible. But where could it be? The Winkman couple's house seemed a likely place. It was late, and their antique shop was already closed. They decided to sneak into the warehouse through the alley. Lockwood easily picked the lock, revealing a room full of antiques. The two stealthily slipped inside. Lucy heard various noises emanating from the relics. These were likely belongings of the deceased. They continued onward, coming across a small shack. Before entering, they paused to listen. Apart from mechanical sounds, there was nothing else. Uncertain of the danger inside, Lockwood instructed Lucy to hide if anyone appeared. As he finished speaking, a child walked out, holding a robot. Hence, it's the mechanical noises. Lockwood asked him if he'd seen a mirror that emitted a buzzing sound like a fly. Before the boy could answer, his mother came out and stunned Lockwood without a word. She was likely Mrs. Winkman. Lucy could only watch helplessly as Lockwood was taken away. Meanwhile, George was still drawing circles on the newspaper, gradually falling asleep like a pig. In his dream, he saw a ghostly figure resembling the deceased Danny. When Lockwood woke up, he found himself in unfamiliar surroundings, but he remained calm, answering Mr. Winkman's questions. When asked about which ghost hunting agency he came from, he couldn't reveal the truth. He feigned being a thief, inviting him to call the police. But Mr. Winkman was not fooled. After all, he carried a sword, hardly the tool of a thief, and no thief would be foolish enough to steal from this place. His reasoning was sound, so Lockwood changed his story, claiming he was an undercover agent sent by the Feats agency. But what Lockwood didn't know was that the Feats team had already visited that day. Having been caught lying twice, Lockwood had little to say. Mr. Winkman guessed that he and Fitz were looking for the same item. He didn't ask what it was, but demanded to know who he was and which agency sent him here. If he didn't tell him, his pale face would soon bear scars. Lockwood decided to face it bravely, knowing that Mr. Winkman couldn't kill him. Killing a ghost hunter would bring him too much trouble. But he forgot one thing, that Mr. Winkman could stage a suicide. Mr. Winkman asked one last question. Who else knew he was here? Lockwood didn't betray Lucy, insisting he came alone. Mr. Winkman decided he needed a lesson and turned on a machine to stimulate him. At this time, Lucy was searching for the mirror. She sensed it was in a safe, but she couldn't open it. The boy appeared. The presence of the mirror disturbed his sleep. Lucy confirmed the boy had a supernatural power. Seeing him holding his robot, Lucy used her psychic abilities and heard crying and screaming. The boy was clearly suffering. She wanted to ask him about Lockwood's whereabouts, but his mother found her. After being stunned, she was locked up with Lockwood. To protect Lucy, Lockwood pretended not to know her. But Mr. Winkman's tactics scared him. He confessed they were colleagues and was willing to reveal everything about the mirror if she would let Lucy go. But Mr. Winkman wasn't interested in a losing deal. He wouldn't let go of someone who was delivered right to her doorstep. At this point, Lucy was already awake. With the speed of lightning, she grabbed a can of gasoline and splashed it towards the couple. She threatened them with a lighter, saying if they dared to come closer, they would be engulfed in flames. Mr. Winkman was helpless and could only watch as they left. Even though they didn't get the mirror, at least they saved their lives. Now that Winkman's identity had been exposed, it was possible he would move elsewhere. They could not let him get away with this. Lucy suddenly thought of the message Lockwood left for Jack. Maybe he had already seen it. George was home alone and could be in danger, so they rushed home. Thankfully, they returned early before Jack could find them, but after only a few minutes, someone knocked on the door. Through the peephole, they saw it was Jack. They immediately went on alert. Lockwood opened the door, ready for a fight, but Jack collapsed after only a few steps with a knife in his back. He was barely alive. Lucy quickly called for an ambulance. With all his strength, Jack uttered a few words about the bone mirror, saying it's a terrifying thing. After speaking, he passed away. But Lucy also heard the words, "Please come with me." These were probably not Jack's words. The Regulatory Bureau arrived quickly and started investigating the scene. George had already found out that Jack was killed with a dagger from the Mughal Empire, made in the 16th century in India. These daggers usually come in pairs. If they could find the other one, they could find Jack's killer. After much persuasion, they finally got Inspector Barnes to agree to their investigation. Before leaving, he warned the three that they were dealing with real living criminals this time. All they needed to do was to find the bone mirror and leave the rest to the Regulatory Bureau. George had been researching the Edmund case and had made progress. It turned out that Edmund was a respected psychiatrist who held secret meetings in his own mansion. If it weren't for a woman named Mary, no one would have known about it. Mary was a missing guest who disappeared after attending one of Edmund's meetings. Strangely, she reappeared 10 years later, completely insane. It was likely related to the bone mirror. George believed that the bone mirror was not only a dangerous relic, but also a unique and rare item. At this point, the skull suddenly spoke, saying that it took too long for him to wake up. Only Lucy could hear the voice. Since the skull knew so much, Lucy suggested that it help them. Unfortunately, the skull was only an assistant. All the answers were with its master, Dr. Edmund. The skull also knew that its master would return to finish what he had started. As for what the bone mirror was and what it was used for, the skull would show Lucy, provided she took it to its master's mansion. There, Lucy would know everything. But the skull wanted something in return. It wanted freedom, since it was stolen by George. Regarding the skull's desire for freedom, Lockwood left the decision to Lucy. Having packed their gear, the trio arrived at Edmund's mansion, infiltrating under the cover of moonlight. The skull began to talk again, advising Lucy not to go in and to wait outside. Lockwood and George were to go in, as only Lucy could communicate with the skull. If Lucy were to die, it would be trapped in the jar forever. Surprisingly, Lucy didn't do as it said. She told Lockwood and George to wait outside for 15 minutes, and if she didn't come out, only then they could go in. Given previous promises, Lockwood had no choice but to obey Lucy. Lucy went into the house with the skull, and as soon as they entered, the skull began to clamor for release. Lucy was not a fool. She would figure out the usefulness of the skull before releasing it. It hurriedly offered to guide Lucy to its master's documents, hidden behind a tightly closed door. Following its directions, Lucy quickly found the door. She could smell traces of cigarette smoke and alcohol, undoubtedly indicating a dining room. Upon opening, there indeed was a table inside, but it was not a dining table. It was some sort of operating table. Placing her hand on it, she felt as if something was being sawed, blood dripping down. Lucy was somewhat afraid and suggested they find what they were looking for and leave. Under the skull's guidance, she found a switch. She pulled it hard, and suddenly, a nearby iron door opened. Meanwhile, George complained that the skull was his theft, questioning why it could communicate with Lucy. 10 minutes had passed, and they had no idea what the skull could be whispering to Lucy. They decided they must go in and check. Lockwood was also worried about Lucy. With that, the two decided to enter the house. On the other side, Lucy entered through the iron door, arriving in a basement. Her flashlight conveniently stopped working, but luckily, there was a kerosene lamp nearby. Lucy lit it and began to survey the room. Suddenly, she heard a noise. It seemed something had detected her. She had to act quickly. With the skull's guidance, she found a document, but it was a step too late. A howling wind whistled past, closing the iron door, and a horde of ghosts appeared. These were actually Edmund's patients. Lucy took the opportunity to crawl to the iron door and call out for Lockwood and George. At this point, the two had reached the dining room and found the iron door. They quickly found the mechanism and opened the iron door, saving Lucy in the nick of time. The three managed to escape safely. Back home, Lucy decided to lock up the skull because its words were untrustworthy. Lockwood noticed footprints on the carpet, but he knew who they were from. As expected, Flo paid a visit, asking if he had found any use for the room at the top of the stairs. He replied no. Flo reassured him that they couldn't avoid these things forever. Lockwood knew he didn't want to discuss this topic. He only wanted to know about the whereabouts of the bone mirror and if Flo had any information. Indeed, she did have information. There was a high-value relic at a private auction tonight at the Forster Key. The area was Flo's territory, and to get in and out, they would need her help. Of course, Flo would assist Lockwood. Before leaving, she arranged to meet him at 11:30 p.m. at the Salt unloading zone. George studied Edmund's documents, which were full of ancient descriptions of ghosts. He believed that ghosts were closely related to haunting sources. After Edmund reviewed these illustrations, he decided to verify this theory. In other words, Edmund intentionally killed his patients in order to create a haunting source. However, he wasn't entirely sure this would work, so he removed their organs while they were still alive, causing massive trauma. This way, the ghosts would forever be bound to the bones. He killed 7 patients in total. To understand how the bone mirror was made, they had to translate the contents of the documents. George didn't know what language they were in, and Lucy had fallen out with the skull, so he proposed that Pamela help out. Another matter of importance was that Mary had written a book of confessions, which could be the key to the whole case. However, it was not published. The only copy was in Feet's library. Now they would have trouble even entering the Feet's building, not to mention the library. At this point, Lucy took out an invitation. It was sent by the Feats agency, inviting the three to attend Feats' 50th anniversary ball, which was that night. This made Lockwood very happy. He immediately started planning their tasks. George was in charge of translating the documents to figure out how the bone mirror was made. Lucy was to attend the banquet, find Mary's confession book, and figure out what Dr. Edmund had done to Mary. If all went well, they could solve the case in one fell swoop. However, Lucy needed to go shopping now. On her way home, she ran into Kipps. Kipps invited her to join his agency, but she did not agree. No sooner had she stepped foot into her home, Pamela arrived with lots of books and food to aid George's research. Lockwood came to the room at the top of the stairs, hesitated for a moment, then opened it. As Lucy dressed in her new gown and reminisced about her friend, Lockwood appeared in formal attire. He gave Lucy a valuable necklace that originally belonged to someone close to him. Now he was entrusting it to Lucy for safekeeping. Before leaving, he called out to George. George was busy, so he gave him a piece of paper and told him to go first. He would follow shortly. When he opened the paper, he found a well-marked map and the library password. The two arrived at the banquet and looked up to find many haunting sources. Lockwood explained that these were all famous relic display racks. As they were talking, Fitz's daughter appeared. Lockwood greeted her and split up from Lucy. As Lucy admired the relics, she ran into Fitz's daughter, who once again extended an offer, hoping she would come to work at the Feats agency. She had investigated Lucy and knew about the things that had happened to her. Her first boss had been fired and could never manage ghost hunters again. Lucy expressed her gratitude for what she had done, but she would not leave the Lockwood agency. The girl didn't pressure Lucy. If she ever needed someone to talk to, she was always willing to listen. Just then, Lockwood appeared, and they set off to find the library according to the map. Meanwhile, George prepared to set off. Before leaving, he took a last look at the cracked glass. Simultaneously, Lockwood and Lucy arrived at the library. Here, Lucy saw a box with the same symbol as on her goggles. Just then, Lockwood called out to her that he had found the confession book's call number. She didn't pay much attention to the box and started to look for the book. After much difficulty, she finally found it, but Fitz's daughter walked in at that moment. They quickly hid. A subordinate came to complain to Fitz's daughter that some clients were complaining that their agency was not doing enough to help them in their work. To appease the clients, she handed the box to her subordinate to pass on to the clients. The item inside had been repaired and tested, and it was working again. After speaking, Fitz's daughter was the first to leave, leaving her subordinate behind. The subordinate noticed a piece of paper on the table. Upon opening it, he realized that someone had snuck in, and he drew his long sword ready for battle. Lockwood wanted to take the opportunity to escape, but was caught. However, with 2 against 1, Lockwood and Lucy managed to escape from the library. The subordinate ordered security to block all exits, but this did not deter Lockwood, who activated the salt-spraying device at the fire extinguishing system. The banquet was plunged into darkness, and the guests were thrown into chaos. Taking advantage of this, Lockwood and Lucy made their escape. Shortly after, George met up with Flo. Lockwood and Lucy arrived soon after. The auction was a distance away from their current location, and Mr. Winkman had already blocked the streets. They could only travel there by water. Upon reaching their destination, Flo asked them to hurry and return quickly and insisted that one person stay behind. They were supposed to draw lots to decide, but there was no time to waste. George volunteered to stay behind, and without any formalities, the others immediately got to work. They passed through the first door without any issues, but the second door was locked. Hearing someone approaching, they quickly hid. They thought they were well hidden, but footprints and the tip of a sword sticking out attracted someone's attention. They had no choice but to reveal themselves. Fortunately, it was one of their own. The undercover agent from the Regulatory Bureau warned them that the people inside were more dangerous than ghosts. He suggested they leave. He had not seen his family for 5 months since infiltrating this place. Their sudden intrusion might put him in danger. The door they had come in through was now locked, but they could leave through another way. He would leave the door open for them. Lucy considered retreating, but Lockwood wanted to push on. Their priority was to find the bone mirror. They returned to the previous room just as a group of people appeared, all dressed in black robes. Seeing this as a good opportunity, Lockwood pulled out 2 robes, and they managed to blend in. Everyone at the auction was there for the bone mirror and showed no interest in the other items. The Winkmans had no choice but to bring out the bone mirror ahead of time. As soon as the bone mirror was revealed, a humming sound filled the room. Lockwood handed a flashbang to Lucy, then slowly moved forward. The Winkmans began to demonstrate the power of the bone mirror, pulling several children in front of it. Lucy couldn't bear to watch. Next up was the bidding segment. The starting price was $50,000. The price skyrocketed, quickly reaching $190,000. Someone, unable to contain their impatience, directly bid $500,000. The room instantly fell silent. It seemed like the deal was about to close. But Lockwood added $20,000 to the bid. The other party instantly raised their bid to $550,000. Lockwood raised his bid again, but the other party shot straight up to $650,000. This was a bit beyond expectation. To ensure it wasn't reckless bidding, the Winkman couple asked the two to demonstrate their financial capacity. The other party handed over an item without hesitation. Lockwood, however, was indecisive. At any moment, he could reveal his identity. Lucy quickly pulled out a flashbang, but before she could light Lockwood's long sword, their identities were exposed. They were immediately apprehended. Seeing Lockwood, they realized Lucy was also present. At this point, Lucy finally lit the flashbang. The room erupted into chaos. Lockwood seized the opportunity to take the bone mirror and pulled Lucy to run, but the door was locked. There was no escape. Mr. Winkman quickly caught up. Lockwood drew his long sword, ready to fight. The undercover agent gently shook his head. He was discovered by Mr. Winkman and had to promptly state he didn't know the two. He was told to deal with the two. At that critical moment, the undercover agent decided to sacrifice himself and cut the chain on the door. Lockwood and Lucy didn't even have time to thank him before they fled. The undercover agent stayed behind, defending the door with his life. The two entered the elevator, but they couldn't escape. The elevator stopped on the 4th floor. The two hurried out. Lucy threw a haunting source into the elevator and pulled Lockwood to run. Lockwood was steeped in self-blame. Lucy told him to buck up and not make the undercover agent's sacrifice in vain. Mr. Winkman was hot on pursuit. Lucy threw another ghost source. They barely passed Mr. Winkman's hurdle when the subordinate from the library came to cause trouble again. It was 2 against 1 again. Without any surprises, they escaped once more, heading straight for the dock. But they exited on the rooftop, and it wasn't easy to get down. They could only call George to prepare to throw the bone mirror. Lockwood was responsible for delaying the subordinate, while Lucy for throwing. The bone mirror was successfully passed. Seeing that, the subordinate lost his sanity, preparing to kill them all. The two had no choice but to jump into the water. They swam to shore, finally turning danger into safety. Meanwhile, George, holding the bone mirror, arrived at the Regulatory Bureau, but he didn't send the item in. Instead, he went to the nearby phone booth. Lucy and Lockwood, unaware of the change in circumstances, waited at home for George to return with the mirror. Since they had nothing to do, they researched Mary's confession book. They were shocked to learn that when the servant held Mary down and Edmund planned to kill her with the evil mirror, Mary shot Edmund with her father's gun and sealed him in an iron coffin. After that, she buried him very deep and claimed it was self-defense. There were also descriptions of the bone mirror in the book. It looked like a mirror, but it was actually a window. Ever since that glance, Mary had been completely infatuated, always wanting to look in the mirror again. Seeing the circle in the middle of the mirror in the illustration and the same symbol on the thinking cloth, they suddenly realized the severity of the problem. Meanwhile, George went to the cemetery to find Pamela. Pamela praised him for his good work. If the bone mirror was given to the Regulatory Bureau, it would be thrown into the furnace and disappear forever. The vast amount of knowledge hidden within it would also vanish. The Regulatory Bureau has always been like this, only knowing destruction and not having an inquisitive mind like the two of them. The bone mirror ended up in Pamela's hands, and the two went inside to study it, unaware that someone was watching them from behind. On the other side, under Lucy's questioning, the skull confessed that George had made a new friend, and George and his friend would meet their demise. Lucy immediately thought of Pamela. Lucy and Lockwood went to get equipment, but there was not much stock left. Only a few salt bullets remained. The two had no choice but to take a risk and try their best to save George. At the same time, George was taken by Pamela's way. A faint noise appeared nearby. Pamela's fragile appearance aroused George's protective instinct. Following the sound, he found Kipps battling a ghost. Seeing that Kipps was about to lose, he immediately stepped forward to help. Kipps was the one who had been watching them outside just now. It turned out, Kipps was coming for the bone mirror. Although George defeated the ghost, he couldn't defeat Kipps. Fortunately, Pamela arrived in time and Kipps could only surrender. Just then, Lucy and Lockwood arrived at the cemetery, bringing the skull with them. The two agreed not to look in the mirror and then broke into the door. Edmund's coffin was opened, but the body was not inside. This could be considered a good thing because they wouldn't get far with a body. It must be somewhere nearby. The two heard that there was an underground tomb here, but they didn't know where to go down. Before they found the entrance, Kips's men arrived. Now was not the time for a standoff. They had to solve the problem quickly. Just as the two sides reached a cooperation, the Winkman's men arrived for the battle. The talented Lucy went to deal with the bone mirror while the others stayed behind to cover her retreat. Lucy found out how to go down. She sensed a sound, and the skull became excited. It could feel its master nearby. It was there when the bone mirror was made. Strictly speaking, the bone mirror is not a single item, but made from the bones of 7 bodies. Because of that, the evil spirit gathered the pain of 7 dead souls. Meanwhile, Kips urged George to reconsider, saying that Pamela would kill both of them. But George would not heed his warning. Just then, he looked up and saw Edmund's corpse. Pamela kept herself busy setting up the scene while explaining her latest findings. She thought it was a mistake for Edmund to mention adults only when he discussed followers every time, because she believed the youths were the key. A sense of unease suddenly washed over George. If it weren't for Kips's timely interruption, he would be the one tied up there now. Pamela didn't deny it, saying that all of this was for the sake of knowledge. Kips pleaded from the side. His abilities were deteriorating, and he could no longer see ghosts. Pamela then took out a dagger to untie him. George paused for a moment, recognizing the dagger, and it was Pamela who had killed Jack. He realized all of this was Pamela's scheme, and he had unknowingly aided and abetted her. Unfortunately, he realized too late. By now, the battle at the door had ended. The ghost hunters had emerged victorious. Lockwood went inside for support, while the others stayed outside. Elsewhere, Lucy found George. He had been tied up. Before Lucy could think of a solution, the skull became excited. Lucy turned around and saw the skull was shouting to release its master's shackles. Taking advantage of Lucy's distraction, Pamela approached from behind. Lucy said that if they had to face the mirror, let George go and let her do it. She claimed that such a great moment should be handled by the best here, and she was the second person after Fetus who could communicate with the Type 3 spirit. Pamela was moved, saying that if she really was as powerful as she claimed, it would be more appropriate for her to do it. Meanwhile, Lockwood encountered Fitz's subordinate again. After so many fights, Lockwood was a bit baffled, unsure whose side he was on. He suddenly brought up Lockwood's parents, saying Lockwood was humble, and his end would be the same as his parents. Lockwood wanted a fair fight, but his opponent didn't play fair. He abandoned cold weapons for firearms, fired a shot, and left without checking whether Lockwood was dead or alive. On the other side, Lucy replaced George. An excited Pamela unveiled the cloth on the mirror. A strong light appeared suddenly. Lucy immediately turned her head away. Pamela roared at her to look at the mirror. She refused, aiming the ghost jar at the mirror instead. The skull got caught in the crossfire, screaming in pain, saying that things weren't going as planned and that they were trapped and had to destroy the bone mirror immediately. Just then, several faces appeared in Lucy's mind. Then she lost consciousness. Seeing this, George rushed forward and knocked down the stand. The bone mirror fell on the ground and cracked. Lucy quickly woke up. Pamela didn't have time for them. She was busy checking if the bone mirror was broken. The bone mirror emitted a strong light, and the cracks were getting bigger. Pamela was completely trapped, unable to even struggle. The bone mirror then shone a strong light on her. After a while, she exploded into dust. The bone mirror was completely destroyed. Several white lights then appeared slowly. Those were the ghosts trapped inside. They didn't attack George and Lucy, but flew freely, then disappeared. Just as Lucy began to smile, her face darkened, realizing that Edmund had appeared. The explosion had shattered his chains. In face of his strong power, both of them were immobilized. He opened his bloody mouth towards them. At the critical moment, Lockwood appeared. With his flying sword and salt bullet, he created a chance for them to escape. Lucy seized the opportunity to seal the corpse with a silver net, causing the powerful spirit to finally disappear. Lockwood also fell down. He had been shot, and it was already difficult for him to hold on until now. Soon after, the Regulatory Bureau took over the place. Lockwood's wound had been treated. He didn't reveal who had shot him. After the incident, Kipps accepted his defeat. Lockwood didn't hold a grudge. They promised they could continue to collaborate in the future if the opportunity arose. The 3 members of Lockwood's agency supported each other as they left. Meanwhile, the subordinate was reporting that the Regulatory Bureau had obtained the bone mirror, which was damaged, although the extent of the damage was unknown. He apologized for not killing Lockwood, but Fittis's daughter didn't blame him. As long as the bone mirror wasn't in Lockwood's group's possession or appearing in public domains, it was fine. Not long after, Lucy verbally recounted this experience and recorded it. But as it involved too many secrets, she could only give a rough account and couldn't reveal any details. She hoped her friend Nori would understand her. The team of three changed the thinking cloth and was determined to start a new life. The ghost jar was still here, and the skull, too. But the skull wouldn't tell what he saw that day. Lucy didn't feel like asking. As it was a part of the past, she didn't want to recall. Lockwood suggested destroying the skull, but Lucy disagreed. Despite everything, the skull was a rare Type 3 spirit, a unique existence, and so was she. As long as no outsiders knew about it, it was fine. One thing was still bothering Lockwood as he remembered the Fitz's subordinate who shot at him had mentioned his parents. He planned to investigate the ins and outs of the whole matter. Speaking of his parents, he also had to admit something related to that secret room. He voluntarily opened the door, leading the two of them inside for an official tour. And with that, the first season of this drama came to a close. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.